Right, so good day to you all. My name is Suzanne Hurter and I am the Energy Simulation Chair on Onshore Gas Reservoir Modelling at the University in Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. And my co-chair, Professor Ray Johnson, has just talked before me. So today I will be talking about the role of modelling in CO2 storage scoping studies. And I will use as an example the work done in UQ-SDAAP, a project that was conducted between 2017 and 2019. UQ-SDAAP stands for University of Queensland Surat Basin Aquifer Appraisal Project. Over 3 years, it was funded by 5.5 million Australian dollars, and this by the Australian government, the Australian coal industry, and the University of Queensland. Although it had more than 44 contributors, I want to here acknowledge my co-authors that have focused more on the modelling work. And it includes also a number of PhD students and an MSc student, Julie Allen, that was conducting her master's through Heriot Watt. So we had a joint opportunity to supervise her. Now, the purpose of the project is to investigate whether or not material CCS might be feasible in Queensland. This study covered 3 areas, and I will be focusing on the technical aspects and more specifically in the subsurface. Now, what we mean by material is that the Surat Basin should supply at least a plateau injection rate of 5 million tonnes per year for at least 20 years. By feasible, we mean that the results should be lowest containment risk, that all non-technical risks would be known and minimized, and that there is a clear work plan to address those before any deployment. High technical confidence is that the injection rate can be sustained for a long time and that CO2 would be contained indefinitely. Third, the retrofit of existing coal-fired power stations would need to be done with minimum disruption to power generation in the state. We also require that there are no obvious showstoppers for pipeline routes from power stations to injection sites. And finally, that the unit cost of abatement and the levelized cost of energy would be in line with published estimates for other CO2 projects. Now, this here is the outline of my presentation, and I will be focused on looking at the simulations for containment, injectivity, and the CO2 migration and spread that are all interlinked. Now, let's have a look at where all of this is situated. So Queensland is the second largest state in Australia. We can fit 7 Great Britons in there. For our North American friends, that would be 2.5 Texases. And on the right, with a bit more detail, here's sort of where we lived in Brisbane. And there is this pile of sand butting into the ocean, Fraser Island, which serves a bit as a reference for other maps. We are 4.5 million people in Queensland. That's about half the amount that lives today in Switzerland. Oh, yeah, and yes, we are able to brag of more than 260 days of sunshine per year. I can feel the envy already. So, coming back to the map, again, here, this pile of sand, Brisbane's here, and there are a number of power stations that emit CO2 as listed on the left. I will focus mostly on these three: Millmerran, Tarong North, and Kogan Creek. And you can see here they emit about 13 million tonnes of CO2 per annum. They still have a lifetime between 30 and 40 years. And older power stations also, they tend to become more efficient with time. Often they can healthily operate for a good time longer than they were initially designed for. Now, if these stations are to be retrofitted to capture CO2, and it is a very expensive investment, they need to be able to be confident in the availability of storage and especially the ability to take the rate of emissions that they're capturing for the duration that they will be doing so. How can we go about it? I think the first point I would like to make is that the storage capacity, as is measured by available pore space, is not useful here to inform a decision to retrofit. Most of these power stations are actually sitting on top of a major sedimentary basin. So the Surat Basin is quite large. It's more than 300,000 square kilometers. This is roughly the size of Germany, or 8 times the Netherlands, where I'm at right now. It crops out to the east and deepens towards the west. And here in the Mimosa Sandcline, we have the thickest sedimentary section of about 2,500 meters. I've also shown here a number of fault systems, and as many of you know, we tend to want to stay away of those when we inject CO2. If we look at it vertically, I am highlighting here the storage play, which is the combination of the Precipice Sandstone and the Evergreen formation. So the bottom of the Precipice Sandstone, we have what we're calling the blocky sandstone reservoir, because of its sort of blocky appearance on the gamma ray log. It is about 80 to 100 meters thick, and it is overlain by what we defined as a transition zone, which is also 100 to 140 meters thick, which is quite heterogeneous and has some sandy, shaly bits in there. On top of it is an ultimate seal, which has quite shaly lithologies in there. Now, this is what it looks like in a simplified cross-section. That's about 300 kilometers in east-west direction. And here we see the blocky sandstone in yellow, a turquoise transition zone, and a dark blue ultimate seal. The concept is to actually inject as deep as possible. CO2 will be supercritical, it will be dense, it will have a low gravity drive. We also anticipate that it will be displacing water to shallower regions. And towards these regions, this sandstone is also tapped for groundwater. The overlying Orange Hutton is also an important aquifer for Queensland. So here I come to another point. Australia's onshore basins have quite fresh water in them. The idea of a saline aquifer for storage does not apply in this country. This implies that storage feasibility studies need to take into account the impact of groundwater and other resources such oil and gas and geothermal, for instance. So how do we go about gaining more confidence in the possibility of storage here? For this, we use a dynamic capacity concept. So dynamic storage capacity is constrained by several things. such as geology, the permeability, porosity, the existence of faults, depth, and so on. Surface constraints, which is where actually can we place our injection facilities, what type of layout and well spacing would we be able to use for large-scale storage, what are the possible interferences with other subsurface users, that is, what's our pressure footprint going to look like. We need to also honor regulatory limits such as license boundaries, pressure limits, and other environmental things. And of course, economics is going to be important. All of this can be combined in a workflow that's shown here, in which we start by looking at the play, which is here the Precipice Evergreen reservoir caprock combination. We then will apply development constraints, both subsurface and surface, and then looked at factors that govern the initial injection rates and how pressure varies over time. We then want to use that to adopt a philosophy of minimum containment risk and a goal of sustainable plateau rates, which are required. This then feeds into an iterative development planning in which we look at a well layout and design. We then use that to simulate injection and sensitivities around parameters. We assess the groundwater impacts, confirm if we are still within the constraints, and then establish what the initial rates and the plateau rates are going to be. Then we go, for instance, to either change the design if that one didn't work out, or to create more scenarios around that. And I can show a bit on an example of what that might look like. So on your right, you see a map. The outline is actually the extent of that Precipice Sandstone. And what you see there is the result of an exercise of applying subsurface constraints. So for instance, the opportunity would be to inject as deep as possible in the reservoir, and the risks would be things such as proximity to faults or other existing wells. So the colored part here is actually what we have available for development. On the middle map, the same exercise was done using surface constraints such as roads, cities, existing pipelines, and so on. And the greener the area is, the less risks are there. And when you superpose both maps, you actually end up here with, we could call it like the suitable area for our surface facilities. And it's defined actually 3 possible sweet spots for us to look at. And this is now translated into the modeling. There are modeling challenges, and some of it has to do with the fact that the reservoir is really quite fantastic. So coal seam gas industry re-injects treated produced water into the precipice. So there is evidence that farmers and town bores at distances of about 100 kilometers have experienced significant increases in water levels because of that. So that means that reservoir can be very well connected over these large distances. So looking at the impact of it requires quite large scale models. On the other hand, we also want to make a careful containment assessment of how the transition zone and the ultimate seal behave. And this will require more high resolution models to look at. Furthermore, we also have that CO2 will be injected at a much lower temperature than the existing reservoir temperature for quite a long time. So this affects fluid density and viscosity, therefore flow, And it also affects rock density and actually cement density around the well too, which contract. And so there are geomechanical aspects that also need to be taken into account. Here you just see a couple of Petrel images of the large regional static model that's been built. It's got 104 million cells with 47 layers, and it includes faults that have been interpreted from seismic. This model has been used to extract what we call our full field reservoir model, which you see represented here in one of its layers. We have tested two different development scenarios, one with horizontal wells and one with vertical wells. So here you see 3 well pads of 6 pads each in the 3 sweet spots. And the way the model works is we start to inject in one, and we add more wells until we are able to match the required injection rate targets at plateau. This, on this side, shows the vertical well scenario in which we have up to 17 wells on each sweet spot. Generally speaking, excuse me, the horizontal well scenario is much better suited. For one, the surface footprint is quite smaller, and for the other, we are able to inject much more at lower pressures. So that's our preferred scenario. Here you just see the breadth of the sensitivities that have been run for these models. And on this slide, what you see is the footprint of the CO2 plume in those models.
Suzanne, you have about 3 minutes to go.
Thank you. So in all models, the plume extent is less than 10 kilometers. And also the front of the dissolved CO2 does not extend much further than 1 kilometer around that. So the groundwater impact can remain constrained to this amount. Now, for looking at the vertical containment, a much more detailed model that includes the heterogeneity of the transition zone and the ultimate seal has been done. And in there, we've modeled a horizontal well from about, that's 1 kilometer long. And we've injected over 30 years, 250,000 tons per year in there. And here what you see on the left is a CO2 saturation image at the end of the injection. And on the right, you see on the top and the bottom, the mass of CO2 injected over time and the water flow over time into that transition zone. So overall, CO2 entered just the lowermost 10 meters of the transition zone. And although during injection, when the pressure is high, flow goes upwards into the transition zone, both CO2 and water. But as soon as it shuts in and the pressure in the reservoir relaxes, the higher pressure in the transition zone then forces that flow to revert and to go back into the reservoir. This here is just to show the range of this in the 3 different sector models. The groundwater impact is an interesting one. So it was modeled very large scale with a hydraulic model, a single phase model. CO2 injection was mimicked by injecting an equivalent volume of water. And you see here water level increases after 100 years of after the injection ceases. The message here is that on a reference case, it shows that pressure increases can be seen widely across the basin, and a large number of water bores are predicted to experience increases of 10 to 30 meters over a 100-year period. So for a dry state like Queensland, this is actually quite a benefit, as it would lower pumping costs. So finally, there is high confidence based on these models that we have a seal complex that is robust, that we can inject a large amount of CO2, and that the containment is quite good. So I'm coming to my conclusions here. So dynamic capacity estimates, they are required to inform decisions. It is likely that we could build a hub that was able to capture and inject about 13 million tons per year over about 30 years. The CO2 plume remains quite limited because it is injected deeply, and it's injected in regions of a very small dip, so it's quite flat. Groundwater levels would be elevated more than a century. And it's important to say that the fact that these water levels increase in wells have nothing to do with a lack of containment. Finally, I am just wanting to acknowledge the government organizations, the mining and oil and gas companies that have supplied us with data and information, the software companies that have provided us with software donations to this. I'd also like to state we have more than 50 very detailed project reports freely available online. I am also thanking here the Chinese organizations that I did not discuss the work of today. And finally, our chair program is in its 4th year now, and we would love to thank Energy Simulation for the continued support of our program. Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you, Dr. Hurter. There's quite a few questions. I will try to ask as many as I can before time is up. From Dr. Russell Johns at Penn State University. Thanks, Suzanne, for a very nice talk. We had a you had a cross section of the aquifer over a large east-west distance. Typically, aquifers are all at normal pressure. Thus, are you planning to model regional groundwater flow where the outcrop is included? This could be important in transporting CO2.
Yes, actually, the groundwater flow models that were shown and were run, and that's my colleague Phil Hayes that ran them, they also include the outcropping areas of those models. And an inversion was done, including also the data on the groundwater bores, which are several thousands in that basin.
Okay. Next one is from Dr. Shaghi of USC. Thank you for the presentation. Because of the natural faulting, are you handling the simulation on individual storage compartments, or are you treating the whole storage as one big unit? And if you are doing it as one unit, how do you know the leaking properties of the faults?
So the faults are included in the mapped faults are included in the model. There has been separate studies done on the transmissivity of those faults and the likelihood of them being affected by CO2. Now, the large scale models that we did, the full field models, show that the CO2 doesn't get anywhere close to the faults, and the faults are not over pressured through that. I also have a PhD student, Ifti Altaf, looking specifically at the flow and mechanical and thermal coupling of this situation on the faults.
Okay.
Yes, one other question is about compartmentalization. Except for a small part of the Precipice Sandstone, it is consistently very almost homogeneous across a very large area. This must have been a huge sedimentary system in the past, in the Jurassic.
All right. Question from VJ of CMG again. Very interesting simulation model, Professor Hurter. Any comments on simulation times and machines used? Did you also use the geochemistry in the modeling?
So the simulation times were kept to, I think, up to 6 hours or so, maximum, for the very large ones. At normal, you would say at desktop workstations. I probably could provide that in more detail. Detail about this is also given in those reports. So it's nothing out of the extraordinary. Now, geochemistry in the modeling, there was a separate geochemical program that included laboratory experiments of on core, and also the modeling of that geochemistry. So in terms of the reservoir, there's not very much reactivity, and it also is quite limited within the transition and the uppermost seal.
Okay, question from Taran Kumar Naya. Thank you for your informative presentation. How water level and quality after storage of CO2?
Okay, so
storage.
Yes, so within the region where the CO2 spreads, it dissolves in water, and we have used that dissolved water as a proxy for water quality degradation. There is some work going on looking at what that might look like by a PhD student of mine that is still working on that, Zhaoling Li. Now, from those models, what we do see is that the part of the water that has been affected is far away from the reach of water wells. Water wells would not be drilled to 2,000 meters in the basin. And the effect on water levels can be quite dramatic. Initially, in some areas, the water levels can go up to 100 meters. And over a very long time, they will be kept up to 20 to 30 meters. So possibly some of the water bores that require pumps might actually become artesian again.
Okay. Question from Dr. David Brun, TU Delft, GFZ Potsdam. Will you consider reactivity of the supercritical CO2 with the reservoir rocks?
Yes, hi David. Yes, this was done, and actually it's my colleague Julie Pierce that has looked at the reservoir rocks and the transition zone and the cap rocks in quite detailed laboratory experiments. Okay, so may as well finish off this last question here. Would it be, from Dr. Dao Yong Tony Yang, would it be necessary to have the horizontal injector fractured with multi-stage fractures for better injectivity? The Precipice Sandstone is blessed. It has a permeability, as it say, you could walk through it with a hat on. It's Darcy level up to several Darcys. So there is no necessity for fracking, and the horizontal wells, so vertical wells inject also quite well, but the horizontal wells allow us to do much larger scale injection at much lower pressures. Okay, this is it for the talk here, and thank you very much for
Dr. Hurter giving us a good presentation on the CCS situation in Queensland.